Okay, welcome back. I'd like to continue on with our reading through Leibniz's Monadology. We're going to start off in our course textbook back on page 23. But this is from Leibniz's Monadology, and it's starting at point 60. So if you want to follow along in your own text, you can do so. I'll throw it up on screen here too, so you can have a look as I do a bit of a read through, and then we'll stop, take a couple of breaks, and do some interpretation of what Leibniz is trying to say here. All right, so have a quick look here. Starting at point 60, I'm just going to read through and see what you make of this. So he says, Leibniz says, further, in what I have just said, there may be seen the reasons a priori why things could not be otherwise than that they are. For God, in regulating the whole, has had regard to each part, and in particular to each monad, whose nature being to represent nothing can confine in it to the representing of only one part of things, though it is true that this representation is merely confused as regards to the variety of particular things, i.e. the detail, all right, in the whole universe, and it can be distinct only as regards a small part of things, namely those which are either nearest or greatest in relation to each of the monads. Otherwise each monad would be a deity. It is not as much regards to their object, but as regards the different ways in which they have knowledge of their object, that the monads are limited. In a confused way they all strive after the infinite, the whole, but they are limited and differentiated through the degrees of their distinct perceptions. Monads, as Leibniz describes them, are something of a reflection of the entirety of the universe, and more particularly, they're kind of a reflection of the perfection of God. However, being the small parts that they are, we know that they're not God, and so monads happen to be relegated to a lesser state and something that's imperfect. However, they do strive towards that perfection, and they do reflect that perfection that God exhibits. Leibniz goes on in point 61, he says, and compounds are in this respect analogous with simple substances, for all is a plenum, and thus all matter is connected together, and in the plenum every motion has an effect upon distant bodies in proportion to their distance, so that each body not only is affected by those which are in contact with it, and in some way feels the effect of everything that happens to them, but is immediately affected by bodies adjoining those which it itself is in immediate contact. Wherefore it follows that this intercommunication of things extends to any distance, however great, and consequently every body feels the effect of all that takes place in the universe, so that he who sees all might read in each what is happening everywhere, and even what has happened or shall happen, observing in the present that which is far off as well as in time as in place. The symphenoia panta, as Hippocrates said. But a soul can read in itself only that which is there represented distinctly. It cannot all at once unroll everything that is enfolded in it, for its complexity is infinite. So monads, as described by Leibniz, looks at the idea that the monads do contain all aspects of the universe, and being such in such a way that's limited. We know that the monads, while they contain all aspects of the universe, aren't everything all at once, which is very much a different aspect than, say, the substance or nature of God. God is infinite. God can be all things at once, if that is the possibility anyway. Monads being limited can only kind of unfold what they contain as aspects of the universe in only one sort of thing at a time, right? In small doses, basically. So monads are limited in that aspect. Let's continue. Point 62, Leibniz says, thus, although each created monad represents the whole universe, it represents more distinctly the body which specially pertains to it, and of which is the entelechy. And as this body expresses the whole universe through the connection of all matter in the plenum, the soul also represents the whole universe in representing this body, which belongs to it in a special way. The body belonging to a monad, which is its entelechy or its soul, constitutes along with the entelechy what may be called a living being, and along with the soul what is called an animal. Now, this body of living being or of an animal is always organic. For as every monad is, in its own way, a mirror of the universe, and as the universe is ruled according to a perfect order, there must also be order in that which represents it, i.e. in the perceptions of the soul, and consequently there must be order in the body, through which the universe is represented in the soul. Remember that Leibniz talks about how God reflects that sort of, or we as inhabitants of the universe, and the universe itself is a reflection of God's perfection. We see that there is an inherent sort of harmony in the universe that indicates that there is the existence of God. And we talked about this the other day, where we know that the argument from design is something that that can be drawn out from Leibniz, in addition to the cosmological argument as well. But the argument from design states that proof for the existence of God is inherent in all the aspects of nature that we see. So for instance, when we look out in the world and we see that there's kind of a predictability or an inherent sort of harmony to the universe, a way in which we can organize, the universe is organized and structured, this is an indicator that the universe isn't just a random happenstance. Alright, so for instance, when we talk about the idea we talk about the idea of gravity, for instance, right? So I pick up this pencil and I let it go, and what happens? Well, it falls, right? And if I do it again, right, it does the same thing again. And I can do this, any number of times, and the same result happens every single time. If it happens every single time, then we have an indication that there is a kind of predictability to it. And in fact, we can even delve a little bit further into the predictability, not in just seeing the observable result. So when Leibniz talks a little bit about, the knowledge that we gain a posteriori as opposed to a priori, right? A posteriori being the observable sort of empirical evidence that allows us to draw conclusions. We see that that gravity works, right? We do instance A, instance B, instance C, put it all together, we know that it's going to fall the next time we happen to do it. But even if we look at this from an a priori perspective, one in which we reason this, we reason this process out, we understand that there are certain physical laws of gravity. We have only to look into Newton's scientific theories, or if you want to get into more advanced stuff, we look at, Einstein's, theories and so on. But anything having to do with gravity really, gives us equations and models by which we can actually show the interactions of the world. Alright, so for instance, we can make a complicated mathematical physical formula that it predicts, that when I pick up this pencil, and I'm sure all of you that have taken like your grade 11 or grade 12 physics can probably model some of those equations with gravity, right? And the fact of gravity on Earth, falling, things falling at 9.8 meters per second or something like that. Those physical formulas that you generate are a reflection of the inherent harmony of the universe. That those models are able to predict those motions of the universe because they're rule sets that govern our universe. If those things were completely random, if there was no predictability in it, if I picked up this pencil and I let go and suddenly it goes upwards instead of falling down, then that would really throw us for a loop. But this doesn't happen. It doesn't happen in our real world because, again, there's a certain structure that's in place already. And because of that predictability, we make a supposition that, hey, if these things are inherently structured and we see this every day, then there must be something to be said that they're put in place by a designer. And you know, if we're talking about the structure of the entirety of the universe, then there's really only one possibility for a designer. And that designer, for lack of any better term, we call God. Now, God reflecting the sort of aspects of perfection, we want to get a little bit further into this notion of the monad, right? The very specific small part that we've got in the universe, the building blocks, if you will, of the universe. So these small little monads, these simple parts to which they have no, internal mechanisms or workings, are the things that kind of reflect that nature of harmony and perfection and so on. And so the idea, going off on that little tangent about perfection and predictability and such, we look at the monads specifically as having that given structure. So the internal workings of a monad, while we have no access to it because we are compound beings that we don't have any smaller parts or any tools by which we can actually access the smaller bits of the monad. We're left at a standstill. But we do understand that there are some properties to the monads that have to be true. Otherwise, we can't have any of those compound substances around us, right? So when I look at my pencil, it's made up of component parts of like the eraser and the little spring mechanism that pops the lead out and so on. The lead inside, the uh, little shirt clip or what have you on the end. These things can be broken down into smaller, simpler parts. But the thing is once we get to the simplest part that has no, particular qualities discernible by us, we understand that that can't be the case, that it makes up compound substances if there are no qualities, right, of these monads. In fact, they wouldn't exist at all if they didn't have any qualities whatsoever. So when we ascribe qualities to the monads, what we are doing is talking about how there's a kind of perceptual difference, all right, between the monads. So for instance, if we're talking about perceptual differences, I tried to explain earlier that that monads, if they have very similar property, or if they have the exact same properties as one another, then it makes it difficult to differentiate one thing from another. In fact, how do we have all the wide variety of compound substances that we see around us if there are no particular qualities to the monads? Leibniz doesn't say that there are no qualities. He says that there are some, but again, it's all a matter of perception. All right, perception, apperception, right? So I've got a little example here of what I try to use to kind of illustrate this in class. And I say, well, okay, take a look at this little button. I picked this up a few years ago at a tourist shop or whatever, but it was kind of a neat little thing, caught my eye, and I said, hey, this is kind of cool to look at. But it makes a really good illustrative tool for what we talk about with Leibniz saying that the monad is something that represents the whole of the universe. And so when we talk about the monad, representing the whole of the universe, we're talking about the monad having all of the possible qualities of the universe. In fact, the entire universe is mirrored, right, in every single monad at every single point everywhere in the universe. And so when we look at, say, for instance, this button, right, so this little lapel pin has an image of a honeycomb with these little green dots in between. And the thing is on the sheet of the button, right, on the plane of the button, there's nothing that's changing, all right, in this image, right? So the image that you see here is fixed, all right. There's no moving parts in this thing. So if you want to look at the back side, it's just a lapel pin, all right. It's very thin on the side, and of course you look at the top and it's just got this image. All right, now you see this image. This image doesn't move. Yet, when we change our viewing angle, so I'm going to do this for you because you can't really move around on the screen, but if you were here in reality with me, then you'd be able to kind of move around, you'd see the changes. But I'm gonna move it for you a little bit. But you see how the image actually changes as we move around the object. You see, what this does is it reflects all the different aspects or different perceptual aspects of the honeycomb pattern. And so we get this illusion, and I actually term it this way. This is actually an optical illusion that kind of shows that there are different facets to this same object. And it's just a matter of the angle or the viewing angle at which we look at this thing. Alright, so as we look at this thing, we kind of see different aspects. It looks like it's moving or it's in motion, but really, the image itself isn't really moving around or anything like that. It's just your viewing angle that happens to change that allows it to change how we perceive it. Now, monads, according to Leibniz, he says really it's all about that change in perception. Right? So we're actually moving, well, not moving, but we're actually seeing those monads at different points in time, and they take on the properties of the compound substances to which they happen to be coalescing together for at the very moment that we look at it. So when we look at, say for instance, the air that you see in front of me here, well, you don't actually see it, right? So there's nothing there. But at any given point in time, you have this sort of airspace at one moment, but at another moment, what occupies that space is this button. Alright, so at one point in time you have the button, at another point in time you have this airspace. Now, remember, the description of the universe according to Leibniz is it's like this box. Alright, so we have like kind of a universe in the box. And remember our conversations back before with the idea of logic in the Venn diagrams is you put the Venn diagram inside this box and you label it with a little U in the top corner and you call this the universe, right? The universe in the box. So we take this box and think of it this way, God in the creation of the universe, has this box. Think of God as like packing the cardboard box. He opens up the lid, and what he does is he stuffs it full of these little packing corns. Those little packing beans that you kind of put in there to protect your item inside the box when it's being shipped, and so on. Well, this is kind of how we might envision Leibniz creating the universe. Alright, so he creates this open universe. It's a box. He opens the lid and he pours all these styrofoam packing beads inside and stuffs it so full and squeezes all the air space out of it, and then promptly closes the lid, and there's the universe. The universe is contained in this little box, and he shoves it off to the side and says, okay, well, we'll look at that later, right? And let it run its course. So the idea that the universe is kind of packed full of these things, these little packing beads. Think of the packing beads as the monads. And so where the packing beads are these monads, there's no space inside that box for the monads to actually move or to interact with each other even, right? Because, you might have a packing bead up in this corner of the box, you might have a packing bead down in this corner of the box, and they're connected through the idea that they're in the box together, or through all the rest of the packing corns that are in between, or the packing beads that are in between. But this monad over here never really interacts with this monad over here. And even if they're right next to each other, they don't do anything to each other because, well, they're the same thing, right? You have one monad here, one monad here. They're the same size, shape, same qualities and everything. They can't really do anything. They can't really interact with each other. Think of them as these, solid sort of little balls or whatever that kind of make up the universe, and so on. Similar to like atoms and such in the universe, where they're kind of these solid masses that don't go to each other. They don't like suddenly mold together and create new substances or what have you. These monads have no windows into their inner workings. They're same size and shape and so on, and so when they come in contact with each other, that's about it. They just kind of stay together, and this is how God packs the universe, right, full of these monads. Now we might wonder, well, how is it that these monads create these compound substances? Well, the thing is as I was describing before, you might have the monads that occupy the space here that I'm kind of outlining with my finger, but what's in between this space? Well, it's air. You can't really see anything. It's just we know that there's like this stuff, the substance that we kind of breathe in and out and so on. If you broke it down into its kind of chemical components, it really does occupy some space, right? However, to our naked eyes, just an empty space, but the monads are there. There are monads there that actually act as air, okay? So at this particular given time that you see, the monads are the air molecules, all right? But at another given time, those monads happen to be the, those monads happen to be the button now, right? So here's the same spot where the button was, or where the air was, and now it's this button, all right? So at one point in time, the monads that occupied that space or air, the same monads at this other time, so the same monads, they haven't gone anywhere because they have nowhere to move, they now become this button. All right, so it's a matter of, again, perception. It kind of shifts its qualities, right, to become this. It shifts its qualities again at another point in time to become that. And you see, it's the same set of monads entirely at any given time, but they become different things as time moves on. Let's read a little further and see what else Leibniz here has to say about the nature of these monads. So if you flip to the next page, or the next set of points, point 64 says, "Thus the organic body of each living being is a kind of divine machine or natural automaton, which infinitely surpasses all artificial automata. For a machine made by the skill of man is not a machine in its parts. For instance, the tooth of a brass wheel has parts or fragments which are not artificial products, and which do not have the special characteristics of the machine, for they give no indication of the use for which the wheel was intended. But the machines of nature, namely living bodies, are still machines in their smallest parts ad infinitum. It is this that constitutes the difference between nature and art, that is to say, between the divine and ours. And the author of nature has been able to employ this divine and infinitely wonderful power of art, because each portion of matter is only infinitely divisible, as the ancients observed, but is also actually subdivided without end, each part into further parts, of which each has some motion of its own. Otherwise it would be impossible for each portion of matter to express the whole universe. Whence it appears that in the smallest particle of matter, there is a world of creatures, living beings, animals, entelechies, and souls." All right, so what Leibniz is on about here is, again, the idea that these monads do reflect everything possible in the universe, and it's really kind of following a divine plan by which it kind of shifts its properties, right, if you will, to become all those various things that we encounter in our daily lives, like the world of creatures and living beings and animals and telechies, souls, and so on. He goes on to say that each portion of matter may be conceived like a garden of plants, and like a pond full of fishes. But each branch of each plant, each member of every animal, each drop of its liquid parts is also some garden or pond. And although the earth and the air which are between the plants of the garden, or the water which is between the fish of the pond, be neither plant nor fish, yet they also contain plants and fishes, but mostly so minute to be imperceptible to us. Thus there is nothing fallow, nothing sterile, nothing dead in the universe, no chaos, no confusion save in appearance, somewhat as it may appear to be in a pond at a distance, in which one would see a confused movement, and as it were a swarming of fish in the pond, without separately distinguishing the fish themselves. Hence it appears that each living body has a dominant entelechy, which in an animal is the soul, but the members of this living body are full of other living beings, plants, animals, each of which has also its dominant entelechy or soul. So from time to time, as monads shift their properties and become other things at various times, what's said to be the entelechy of the object, or Plato might have termed it something along the lines of maybe essence, okay? Whatever happens to be the driving thinking force, quote unquote, of an object, whatever is the essential quality that makes it what it is at the time, that entelechy is what binds the monads at the time to the properties of whatever it's demonstrating. So what I mean by this is, say for instance, if the monads that are occupying this space is my hand specifically, all right, well, there's a certain entelechy to this object, a certain essential quality that makes this hand my hand. And in this case, what happens is the monads are sort of bound together with the essential quality of being my hand at this particular time, at this particular moment. The next moment that goes by, those monads shift properties or, perceptions, and we end up with the airspace where my hand used to be. And so the dominant entelechy at that point in time is, the concept of it being air. And so that's really what Leibniz is going on about there. Point 71, Leibniz goes on to say, but it must not be imagined, as been done by some who have misunderstood my thought, that each soul has a quantity or portion of matter belonging exclusively to itself or attached to it forever, and that it consequently owns other inferior living beings which are devoted forever to its service. For all bodies are in a perpetual flux, like rivers, and parts are entering into them and passing out of them continually. Thus the soul changes its body only by degrees, little by little, so that it is never all at once deprived of all its organs, and there is often metamorphosed in animals, but never metapsychosis, or metamorphopsychosis, there's a mouthful, or transmigration of souls. Nor are their souls entirely separate from bodies, nor unembodied spirits, genies sans corps. God alone is completely without body. It also follows from this that there never is absolute birth, generation, nor complete death in the strict sense consisting in the separation of the soul from the body. What we call births, or generations, are developments and growths, while what we call deaths are envelopments and diminutions. If we take this understanding of the monads being always kind of in this state of shifting from property to property to embody the objects that we encounter, or that we are actually, in fact, there's never, in the strictest sense, birth or death of anything. Because, for instance, the monads where I happen to be occupying this space right now, they contain my particular soul, if you will, that embody who I am at this particular time in this moment. But again, remember, monads don't move with me. Like my monads, or the monads that kind of make up who I am, don't go along with me when I kind of shift from one spot to the next. So if I kind of, move from here to here, right, the monads aren't moving. What's happening is again, drawing back to that earlier point, when I shift my body position, for instance, the monads that were air on, this side of me, became me, right? And as I move a little further, the monads that were in that airspace became me, and the monads that were me over here become the airspace. So my soul, or the object's entelechy, or what have you, tends to go with it, but the monads never actually move from spot to spot. It's really just the perceptual difference that each monad kind of shifts to take on those properties of embodying me, my person. And so what happens here is that if we were looking at the strict sense of birth and death, who I am doesn't really, get born. It doesn't really die. In some ways, if you want to look at this from the longer term standpoint, it's something of an uplifting possibility, right? That if monads are always in constant flux, then my moving from one spot to the next, you might look at identity theories and stuff like that from before, that might result in my death, right? That my shifting from one position to the next, well, suddenly, the monads that were there that were making me up are no longer me anymore. So did I just die in that moment that I moved? No, probably not. Okay. But the thing is if you want to look at it in its strictest sense, the idea of death is when the soul kind of moves away, or what have you. In a technical sense, maybe I did die moving from one spot to the next. For Leibniz, he says, no, you didn't really die. I mean, your soul kind of goes with you as you move from state to state. In fact, basically, it's just the monads also contain, the reflection of your soul as well. That's how I interpret it anyway. They kind of reflect your notions of your soul, so that as you move from one spot to the next, well, you go along with it. In some ways, you might look at this as a form of immortality. The fact that even as I die and my body breaks down into its component parts and so on, the reflection of who I am as a person is again contained in every monad, spread throughout every monad in the universe. So I never really die. My body might die, dissolve, disappear, whatever, get reabsorbed, recycled into different compound substances. But the thing is the person that makes me up is still existent in those monads elsewhere as part of its grand sort of plan or scheme. And so that might be kind of the hopeful outlook of Leibniz's theory here, is that in dissolution of the body, we don't really have death. We still have the kind of immortality of the soul. And so that might be something that you take away from the possibility here of the monadic structure being correct. Alright, so let's look a little bit further on here. Alright, so point 74. Leibniz says, philosophers have been so much perplexed about the origin of forms, entelechies or souls. But nowadays it's become known through careful studies of plants, insects, and animals that the organic bodies of nature are never products of chaos or putrefaction, but always come from seeds, which there was undoubtedly some preformation. And it is held that not only the organic body was already there before conception, but also a soul in this body, and in short the animal self, and that by means of conception this animal has merely been prepared for the great transformation involved in its becoming an animal of another kind. Something like this is indeed seen apart from birth or generation, as when worms become flies and caterpillars become butterflies. The animals of which some are raised by means of conception to the rank of larger animals may be called spermatic, but those among them which are not so raised but remain in their own kind, that is, the majority, are born, multiply, and are destroyed like the large animals, and it is only a few chosen ones that pass to a greater theatre. But this is only half the truth, and accordingly I hold that if an animal never comes into being by natural means, or naturellement, no more does it come to an end by natural means, and that not only will there be no births or generation, but also no complete destruction or death in the strict sense. And these reasonings made a posteriori are drawn from experience, are in perfect agreement with my principles deduced a priori as above. So no matter which way you tackle it, whether you go from a sort of purely reason standpoint a priori, or whether you actually do this from observable experiment out in the natural world a posteriori, you arrive at the same possible conclusion. And according to Leibniz, the conclusion is that there is no absolute death, there is no absolute sort of generation. It's just a matter of flux and shifting perception that happens to bring something into being and for it to move and for it to quote unquote go out of being. It never really does go out of being. It just becomes something different. And again, this is the point that I made earlier about there being no sort of maybe it being a hopeful outlook that we have a kind of immortality here. And then he reiterates that point again in point 77, where he says, thus it may be said that not only the soul, mirror of an indestructible universe, is indestructible, but also the animal itself, though its mechanism or machine may often perish in part and take off or put on an organic slough. These principles have given me a way of explaining naturally the union, or rather the mutual agreement, of the soul and the organic body. The soul follows its own laws, and the body likewise follows its own laws, and they agree with each other in virtue of the pre-established harmony between all substances, since they are all representations of one and the same universe. Souls act according to the laws of final causes, through appetitions, ends, and means. Bodies act according to the laws of efficient causes or motions. And the two realms, that of efficient causes and that of final causes, are in harmony with one another. Now, Descartes recognized that souls cannot impart any force to bodies, because there is always the same quantity of force in matter. Nevertheless, he was of the opinion that the soul could change the direction of bodies. But that is because in his time it was not known that there was a law of nature which affirms to the conservation of the same total direction in matter. Had Descartes noticed this, he would have come upon some system of pre-established harmony. Now Leibniz actually does, right, come up with this sort of conception of a pre-established harmony. That if we look at the universe as a whole, the universe has to work in perfect harmony. The universe has to work in concert with each other, or the things within the universe have to work in concert with each other. You have to remember that if the monads in this box that we call the universe are packed so tight that there's no movement or any possibility of shifting spaces from one place to the next, then the shifting perceptions of the monads have to happen in coordination with each other. If they're not happening in coordination with each other, then we end up with some big problems. The big problems being violation of the law of non-contradiction. What happens? Well, the thing is if monads are not working in concert with each other, what happens is we can possibly have things that exist and not exist at the same time, same context, same place. So for instance, if again monads are containers of the universe, right, or mirror reflections of the whole of the universe altogether, then it's possible to actually have, me occupy this space and another space at the same time, right? Or me occupy this space and not occupy this space at the same time, because that would be allowable, right, if there were no governing forces here. If there was no grand plan as for the monads being me here in this particular moment in this space, as opposed to me being here in this particular moment in space with the monads, if there was no coordination from one monad to the next with that shift from here to here, then suddenly you might end up with either duplicates of me, or maybe none of me, or some of me in this spot and some of me in another spot, which means that I kind of occupy this space and not this space, right? It leads to a whole wide range of crazy things that we don't want to allow in the universe. And so, Leibniz says that really we have to have this sort of coordination, or this mutual agreement of the bodies that the monads kind of make up, the physical sort of bodies that the monads make up, because otherwise we end up with these massive problems with contradiction. And so when we look at the principles of monads and how they're governed, we see, and as we read a little bit further on, you're going to see that the monads' motions, their appetitions, their changes in perception are all coordinated from one grand master plan. That grand master plan, of course, is developed by, or prescripted by, God. Because God creates everything at the very beginning of the universe, we have no choice but to have the monads follow this plan right down to the letter, right down to the T, right, dot your I's and T's type thing, right? So the grand plan, the blueprint that God creates for the universe is followed in its exactest possible way by every single monad in the universe, so that the monads that are me right now in this particular space know that at the next moment when I'm over here, to actually change into the air molecules that kind of make up that space where I'm not there anymore. Again, remember, the monads don't shift with me, but the thing is there has to be a coordinated change in perception, right? So there's a monad that's sitting right here, that's me, and then suddenly, it knows that at the next moment it has to kind of shift its perception so that it's not me, right? So it's the airspace there. And so every movement or motion in the universe, every generation of an item, every dissolution of an item has to happen with a coordinated sort of effort. If you think of the example of maybe some, I don't know, think about like stage dancers, right? If you have a number of dancers that are on stage and they do an elaborate sort of dance where they're kind of moving about with one another, and they're kind of picking each other up and swinging each other around, that sort of thing. Those are all coordinated movements. But the thing is they're all pre-planned, right? So the dance that somebody does on stage, the dancing partners, for instance, they're all working according to their own individual plan. So partner A has a plan where they actually move from one spot to the next. Partner B has another, plan that they follow to move from one spot to the next. And the idea is the plans are worked in sync with each other so that they actually have a coordinated movement. Are they actually interacting with each other? Well, from our viewing standpoint, where we're sitting on in the audience watching, we say, oh, "Wow, look at the coordinated movement between these dancers." But really, in fact, the coordination is an illusion. That the dancing partners are all following their individual plans, and it just happens to look like they're dancing together. They're occupying the same space in the stage, but you know partner A is following their plan of where they're stepping and what space they're occupying. Partner B is doing the same thing, and it just looks like they're working together, that they're kind of interacting with each other when they're really not. So the following the plan is really important for something like dancing on stage, because if they're not coordinated and they're not working towards a plan that lays out exactly their movements and places on stage, well, dancer A moves this way, dancer B moves this way, and then suddenly if they're not working according to a coordinated plan where they avoid each other, well, suddenly what happens? Well, they crash into each other, right? They fall, they hurt each other, that sort of thing. So the universe has to work in that harmonious fashion. There has to be that sort of idea of coordinated movement. Otherwise, the universe kind of falls apart or grinds to a halt. I think Leibniz uses the example of like the brass wheel in a kind of complicated machine. What he's referring to is something like, a modern day analogy would be like a car. If you ever look at a car engine, for instance, it's a very complicated machine. It has cogs and wheels and belts and pulleys and a whole range and host of different parts and materials. And the thing is like, say for instance, if you've ever encountered car problems, where for instance you're driving down the road and you hear this awful grinding sounding and suddenly your engine falls out from you, right? Well, this is what happens when a cog in the machine doesn't work. Very small parts and little minuscule parts that go into an engine. There's thousands upon thousands of these things. They all have to work in perfect harmony and coordination with each other. If you end up stripping a cog, or one tooth happens to be out, well, what happens? Well, the next larger cog doesn't work or binds with it, and then the belts stop moving, and then suddenly the whole machine just comes crashing down because of a failure of one small part in following through on the motion that it's supposed to do. The universe in itself works in the same way. It's one grand machine that is working. All the various cogs and pistons and belts are pulling and firing in a coordinated motion to drive the universe forward. If any of those parts are uncoordinated, or there's something missing, or something gets caught up or doesn't do what it's supposed to do, well, suddenly the whole machine comes crashing down. The universe stops. And for Leibniz, this can't happen. And that's why he says that there has to be a kind of perfect harmony to the universe. The universe is a perfect machine, according to Leibniz. Perfect machine because it's created by the perfect creator, God. Okay, so let's look at point 83. It says, among other differences which exist between ordinary souls and minds, some of which differences I have already noted, there is also this, that souls in general are living mirrors or images of the universe of created things, but that minds are also images of the deity or author of nature himself, capable of knowing the system of the universe and to some extent of imitating it through architectonic ensembles. Each mind being like a small divinity in its own sphere. It is this that enables spirits to enter into kind of fellowship with God, and it brings about that in relation to them, that he is not only what an inventor is to his machine, which is the relation of God to other created things, but also what a prince is to his subjects, and indeed what a father is to his children. Whence it is easy to conclude that the totality of all spirits must compose the city of God, that is to say, the most perfect state that is possible under the most perfect of monarchs. This city of God, this truly universal monarchy, is a moral world in the natural world, and this is the most exalted and most divine among the works of God, and it is in this that the glory of God really consists for he would have no glory were not his greatness and his goodness known and admired by spirits. It is also in relation to this divine city that God specially has goodness, while his wisdom and his power are manifested everywhere. So again, we kind of reiterate that point about the harmony and nature of God in the universe, and the fact that when we kind of work towards this plan, or when we work through this blueprint that God has kind of imbibed or imbued, the monads with, then we kind of enter a connection with God. We end up formulating this kind of harmonious connection. And this is the point at which maybe theologians kind of look at us, having this connectedness with God. This is kind of the possibility that Leibniz is actually playing with here. Yeah, let's move on to point 87. He says, as we have shown above that there is a perfect harmony between the two realms in nature, one of efficient and the other of final causes, we should here notice also another harmony between the physical realm of nature and the moral realm of grace. That is to say, between God, considered as architect of the mechanism of the machine, and God, considered as monarch of the divine city of spirits. As a result of this harmony, is that things lead to grace by ways of nature, and that this globe, for instance, must be destroyed and renewed by natural means at the very time when government of spirits requires it, for the punishment of some and the reward of others. It may also be said that God as architect satisfies in all respects God as lawmaker or lawgiver, and thus that sins must bear their penalty with them through the order of nature, and even in virtue of the mechanical structure of things, and similarity that noble actions will attain their rewards by ways which, on the bodily side, are mechanical, although this cannot and ought not always to happen immediately. Finally, under this perfect government, no good action would be unrewarded and no bad one unpunished, and all should issue the well-being of the good, that is to say, of those who are not malcontents in this great state, but who trust in Providence, after having done their duty, and who love and imitate, it is meet, the author of all good, finding pleasure in the contemplation of his perfections, as is the way of genuine pure love, which takes pleasure in the happiness of the beloved. That it is which leads wise and virtuous people to devote their energies to everything which appears in harmony with the presumption or antecedent will of God, and yet makes them content with what God actually brings to pass by his secret, consequent, and positive decisive will. Recognizing that if we could sufficiently understand the order of the universe, we should find that it exceeds all the desires of the wisest men, and that it is impossible to make it better than it is. not only as a whole and in general, but also for ourselves in particular, if we are attached, as we ought to be, to the author of all, not only as to the architect and efficient cause of our being, but as to our master and to the final cause, which ought to be the whole aim of our will, and which can alone make our happiness. Alright, so basically we kind of end off there where, Leibniz again reiterates the point that we do enter a kind of connection to that perfection, for lack of a better word, we call God. And the thing is because we see the inherent harmony of the universe, and that the motions of the universe are governed and predictable, and all these sorts of things that we see and make a conclusion towards a posteriori, lead us to believe that there is some designer, right? The universe is designed because we can see that inherent harmony and perfection, because those things that we deal with in our everyday lives are not just simply random happenstances, that they are intended, predictable events. It leads us to believe that there is some form of, designer that creates this grand design. And the structure by which Leibniz kind of establishes the very small part, the little monads that kind of make up the entirety of the universe. We start from that very small piece and kind of build our theory up towards the notion of that grand designer. This reflects back to, of course, the further theory of how the monads can possibly work, and so on. And we realize that the whole of our universe is really just kind of a grand, perfect machine, all right, that kind of runs its course through the time of the universe. And so there's a lot of stuff to unpack here from Leibniz. There are some implications here that we can draw from it as well. One of those implications that we kind of discovered was the possibility that we kind of live a life of that's immortal. That there is no sort of while there's technically, from a standpoint that we kind of understand things, there's generation and death. According to Leibniz, this has no meaning, right, in the universe that he kind of interprets here. That the constant flux of monads shifting from one perception to the next and so on really gives us the illusion of generation and death, but really, in fact, all it is just redistribution. Shifts in perception from one moment to the next. And so when we look at other further implications we might see is, again, this idea that the universe is a grand, perfect working machine. If this machine needs to work according to a very well-defined, very specifically planned blueprint, again, we go back to the analogy, for instance, of the dancers on stage not crashing into each other because they follow prescripted movements. When we talk about the car engine, for instance, where if the part doesn't work exactly how it's expected to work, the gears grind against each other and then suddenly the whole machine falls apart. Well, for Leibniz, the universe is the machine. The universe is the grand dance of all the sort of perceptual changes of the monads. And so if we don't have a perfectly well-oiled working machine, suddenly the universe comes to a standstill, it comes to a halt, which doesn't indicate the perfection of the machine. So again, as Leibniz talks about, the machine being kind of a perfect working machine, a perfectly ordered machine, perfectly prescripted machine. One further implication that we might have trouble with, that I leave you with in consideration, is the notion of whether we as human beings, in this world that we live in, this perfect machine, as Leibniz terms it, do we have free will? According to Leibniz, there's no such thing. because we are prescripted in every single movement, because if they're not prescripted, suddenly the whole machine comes crashing down. Every movement that I make, every word that I speak, everything that I point to or interact with, it's all prescripted. It's all prescripted because otherwise we'd have monads crashing into each other. We'd have things that are there but not there at the same time. We'd end up with a whole bunch of contradictions, that sort of thing. This doesn't happen in our universe. And so the one of the other grand implications coming from Leibniz and this possibility that we are, that we are designed creatures, all right, or that this whole universe is designed and prescripted, is that we have no free will. Take it as you will. Um, no pun intended there. But it's possible that this is a good outlook in that we don't have to worry about what happens from one moment to the next because it's prescripted. But it also can be somewhat dismal in the fact that I have no choices that I'm making. That maybe the life that I'm leading, going from one moment to the next, is kind of pointless, or there's no point to it other than to simply follow the plan. Um, I think this is the thing that most thinkers have trouble with when they read through Leibniz, is the possibility that we have no free will. But in order for Leibniz's system to work, I think this is kind of where we're left. And not to say that there's no criticisms against this particular theory, um, but it does have some interesting things to look at. And it does make a kind of logical sense as well when we kind of build this up from Leibniz's framework here. But again, consider those questions for Leibniz. The takeaways are, the takeaways are, do we have a kind of immortality? All right. When it comes to Leibniz's system of thinking here, and do we have any possibility of free will? That's it for now. Thanks for listening. If you have any further questions or concerns, by all means, message me or catch me in class. Good luck with your further reading in Leibniz. Again, I always recommend that you read through one more time after kind of hearing us, talk things out here. Read it with that in mind, and you might get something more of it as well. Again, I read this thing from semester to semester, and I'm always catching new things from it. So it's always a constant reading exercise. But again, take away those things that I've mentioned, and good luck with your further reading. Thanks for stopping in.